Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the National Stock Assessment Science Seminar Series. My name is Bailey. I coordinate this monthly seminar series, highlighting interesting advances and topics in stock assessment science. Today, we have Dr. Abby Tyrell with us. Abby received her PhD in marine science from Stony Brook University, and now she works as a research fish biologist in the Ecosystem Dynamics and Assessment branch at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. Her work broadly focuses on improving ecosystem science for fisheries management by leveraging data science and automation. During today's seminar, we'll look at ecosystem and socioeconomic profiles. Now with that, I'll pass it over to Abby.
Hi, thank you for the introduction, Bai. I am going to go ahead and share my screen. And since I'm sharing my screen, I'm going to turn my camera off because it obscures the bottom right corner, and there's a lot of things in the bottom right corner of these slides. So thank you very much for having me. My name is Abby. I'm a research fish biologist at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. And today I will be presenting on the Ecosystem and Socioeconomic Profile initiative that has now grown to include many people across the country, including my co-authors from the Northeast Alaska and headquarters. So I want to start out by acknowledging all of the many people who have supported and contributed to this initiative, which is included but not limited to all of the different groups listed here. So I'm going to start out today by giving an overview of the Ecosystem and Socioeconomic Profile, or ESP, initiative and its goals and objectives as they currently stand. And then I'll describe the work and collaborations that helped us get to this point. That will be focused on the two regions of Alaska and the Northeast to highlight how the process has been similar but also different across the two regions and how we can use the lessons learned to build a stronger product in the future. And then I'll wrap up by discussing our relatively new national ESP initiative and some plans and ideas that we have for future development. So we've gotten to the point where we have an ESP framework, and that is about 10 years in the making at this point. So I will introduce this current framework, its purpose and process. ESPs came about as a framework to incorporate information about our changing systems into our fisheries science advice for management. We see climate change manifest in fisheries population processes through things like distribution shifts, variable growth and recruitment, and in physical processes such as circulation changes, temperature fluctuations, ice shifts, and finally in the socioeconomic arena through market dynamics, fishery behavior changes, and new ocean uses. So all of this change affects the precision and accuracy of stock assessment models. When there's no mechanism for the stock advice process to incorporate changing environmental information, the resulting reference points and harvest control rules can't accurately reflect the system, and that can result in a situation where, for example, a stock ends up being overfished even if no quotas are exceeded, or a stock that is overfished may fail to meet recovery targets because the target population levels are not possible under new climate conditions. And so ESPs are a framework to include this additional contextual information within the stock assessment and advice process. So currently we have parallel but separate systems for integrating single stock and ecosystem and economic information into reports that are delivered to fisheries managers. So on one side, we have single stock assessment reports, and then on the other, we have comprehensive ecosystem status and economic reports. And what we did not have prior to the creation of the ESPs was a clear pathway to understand how that ecosystem and socioeconomic information translate into the stock-specific situation. So this created a gap in communication and could result in reactive rather than proactive strategies because the system was not necessarily designed to anticipate changes to equilibrium conditions. So the ESPs were designed to change this paradigm by providing a framework through which existing ecosystem and economic information can be interpreted on a single stock scale, synthesizing contextual information and providing a more holistic view of the stock. Because fisheries management typically occurs on that single stock level, it's important for the ecosystem and socioeconomic information to also be presented in a way that facilitates its application to a single stock. So by tracking contextual ecosystem and socioeconomic information in the same place, patterns that could be impacting the stock or the fishery will become more apparent and easier to monitor over time. And this standard framework also helps facilitate the interpretation of the data and updates to that data in future years, which can help NOAA fisheries work towards ecosystem-based fisheries management and track progress towards ecosystem-based fisheries management. So our general ESP process builds on a long history of identifying ecosystem pressures on stocks in all of the regions across the nation. But we're now taking things a step farther by designing a standardized framework that provides guidance around data curation, analysis, and reporting, including methods to test linkages between the ecosystem and the stock of interest, and guidance on how to incorporate that information into the scientific advice that is provided to fisheries management councils. So we have 4 general steps to the ESP process, and I'll be giving specific examples of how these steps were implemented in both Alaska and the Northeast. But first, just to give a general overview, we start out by developing a list of priority stocks in the focus step, which is conducted by reviewing the available information on stocks and combining those information with regional priorities to develop a short list of target stocks for ESPs. And then we synthesize the available information on that stock through literature review and create an ecological synthesis that summarizes processes driving stock dynamics and identifies mechanistic linkages for the stock, which leads to defining a suite of indicators to monitor and analyze trends and linkages using tests appropriate to the data availability for that stock. And finally, the process is completed with a concise report that conveys the status of the leading indicators to fisheries managers within the stock assessment cycle. So once the ESP is completed, that information can feed into several areas of the stock assessment and management process. We've conceptualized these potential impacts into 2 main categories. First, there's qualitative, the qualitatively informing uncertainty and providing additional context about the conditions that the stock is experiencing. So, for example, risk tables are one method being implemented by more and more fisheries management councils, and they use contextual information to characterize the uncertainty in the model results and to translate that uncertainty into adjustments to the catch advice. So beyond the mathematical uncertainty in the stock assessment model, risk tables also typically incorporate system level uncertainty, for example, whether there are recent anomalies in the ecosystem that could potentially impact the stock, but that are not currently being incorporated into the population dynamics modeling. So other ways that qualitative information could impact the fisheries management decisions could include rebuilding plans, discussions about total allowable catch, survey planning, setting research priorities, and being incorporated into a funding request for proposals. And then the other general category of ways that ESPs can inform stock science would be quantitative input to the stock assessment models. And we break that down into model assumptions, choices, and covariates. So these are all different ways that information about the ecosystem can improve the alignment between the population dynamics model and then the true reality of what is going on with the stock in the ocean. And so types of these more quantitative decisions could be things like making sure that the stock assessment model is consistent with the life history of the stock, incorporating additional biological realism into the model, making decisions about time blocks during the modeling process, and at the most quantitative level, including a direct ecosystem covariate into the stock assessment model, which is now possible in newer modeling platforms such as the Woods Hole assessment model. So that's where ESPs have ended up. It's been about 10 years, like I mentioned, since the concept of the ESPs was first developed, and that was developed at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center by Kalei Shotwell, one of my close collaborators on this project. And so to give a better understanding of the entire ESP process, I'm first going to go into a description of how that process began in Alaska, how it's grown and changed, and what they have accomplished over time. So the ESPs first came about in 2014 as a solution to revamp the ecosystem consideration section in their stock assessment reports that were often out of date. So then the ESP concept went through a phased development and improvement process through review with the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council advisory bodies for both groundfish and crab. And that ultimately led to the first Ecosystem and Socioeconomic Profile being published for sablefish in 2017. And then in 2020, a more formalized ESP format was created as ESPs began to be developed for more and more stocks. So in total, currently there are 7 ESPs completed across groundfish and crab stocks. And after those ESPs are created, they are continuously updated and improved through ongoing reproducibility and streamlining projects, most recent of which is a new report card format through which the ESPs are updated each year. There also have been several center workshops to improve ESP development since 2019, and now we have continuing cross-regional and national collaborations where we're working on refining several of our methods as well. So here's a summary of the 7 current ESPs that are maintained for Alaska stocks. There's 4 groundfish, 3 crab. Generally, there's about 2 or 3 new ESPs conducted each year, and then starting in 2001, the shorter report card updates are produced each year that the stock is assessed. So that's why, for example, the blue king crab is assessed only every other year, and the ESP is updated in conjunction with that assessment. And there is now a total of 17 ESPs that have been recommended by the Fisheries Management Council, which includes several additional species. And next, I will go into a little more detail about how the steps of the ESP process have been conducted in Alaska. So that first step is focus, so determining which stocks are priorities and should be the first in line for ESP development. So this step was completed by conducting a comprehensive assessment of metrics across stocks to identify which stocks have concerning population trends or might be more at risk from climate change, because those are the stocks where incorporating that contextual ecosystem information could best improve the scientific advice that we produce for those species. So the metrics assessment identified sablefish as a strong starting point because they have high commercial importance, high variability in recent recruitment estimates. Their early life history is fairly sensitive to habitat. Additionally, sablefish is data rich, and it had been identified as a high priority in the regional action plan due to the extreme variability in their recruitment. So continuing through to the next step of the ESP development, there's the synthesize step, which serves to gather the existing knowledge on the stock to help shape data collection and analysis. So descriptive sablefish data was gathered to develop a mechanistic understanding of the stock's life history and current status. So pictured here is the conceptual model that was created for sablefish to describe key pressures on the different life stages. And so some of the key information that was identified through this conceptual model was the optimal temperature ranges, some bottlenecks in life history, and also some condition metrics that could be used to track the health of different age classes. Now, once the ESP team has an informed understanding of the stock's life history, they're ready to analyze the ecosystem and socioeconomic data to better understand the story of the stock. So the Alaska Center is currently rolling out a new process called the Request for Indicators, which is an open request centered on the Science Center to solicit data from people who have subject matter expertise. And another advance that has also benefited the analyses in the Alaska Center is a data uploader through which contributors can submit their data, which streamlines the data tracking and management. The majority of the indicator data that are collected are in the form of time series, which are then assessed with a common set of statistical trends to determine status relative to past years. So to determine generally if ecosystem conditions are more favorable than usual, less favorable than usual, or near average. And then finally, a suite of ecosystem indicators are tested against recruitment with Bayesian adaptive sampling to determine any potential linkages between the ecosystem and the performance of the stock. And this same statistical process could also be tested, or it could be applied to test other linkages between the system and the stock. So finally, the Alaska Center has developed a really nice standardized reporting format, and this report is included as an appendix to the main stock assessment report. The report consists of an introduction to justify why we are doing the ESP for this stock, the metric assessment that identifies ecosystem and socioeconomic drivers on stock dynamics, the indicator assessment that lists time series to monitor and statistical tests and results, and then finally the recommendation section with the main takeaways of the report that can be used for management decisions. And that final section also provides some information on data gaps and research priorities for the stock. So in including this ESP with the stock assessment, we hope to provide context for how ecosystem and socioeconomic drivers influence the stock productivity by informing that risk table process, identifying mechanistic linkages so that can help us condition the data inputs into stock assessment, for example, like I mentioned, defining time blocks or identifying surveys or indices that could be used in the model, and then finally evaluating specific indicators that have a high potential for being included within the stock assessment model as an ecosystem covariate. So after this ESP is produced, the lead stock assessment author reviews the report and determines how to use the information in the main stock assessment document for providing advice to management. And then, like I mentioned, there's a shorter report card update that follows in all of the preceding stock assessments after the initial ESP is developed so that we continue to update and track these indicators over time. So this is what the Alaska workflow looks like. Most of their stock assessments run on an annual or biannual schedule, although there's a few outliers on a 4-year schedule. And the ESP schedule has been developed to synchronize with that stock assessment schedule. It's tends to be very regular and does not deviate much year to year. So the formal request for an ESP is submitted by the council following their fall meetings. And then that ESP is prepared over the next 1 to 2 years and delivered to the stock assessment team at the start of the assessment cycle, which is either in spring or fall, depending on if it is a groundfish or crab species. So I'll go through the sablefish example to illustrate how this has come to pass in Alaska. So like I mentioned, the first sablefish ESP was developed in 2017. Sablefish had recent but very uncertain large year classes. So the environmental conditions were generally favorable for about the first year of life, but then there were some other indicators that suggested that maybe the older juveniles were experiencing unfavorable conditions. And so that was characterized with several ESP indicators of condition of various age fish, some metrics of competition and predation. And so when you considered this more comprehensive ecosystem picture in consideration with concerns about the likelihood of these large year classes truly coming to recruit into fishable sized fish, the stock assessment author suggested a fairly large reduction in the maximum acceptable biological catch to account for this inherent uncertainty in the system, and that was approved into fisheries management through that risk table process. The uncertainty in ecosystem conditions was a justification for lowering the acceptable biological catch because these large year classes might not actually materialize into biomass that could then be fished. So the ESP has also provided a medium to explore contextual information about sablefish juveniles, which are very important life stage. And so the ESP has been a place where they can include observations of juveniles from multiple sources that are not used in the operational assessment. So that would be things like seabird diet, nearshore trawls, bycatch and non-target fisheries, some of which are now being explored as new covariates for the stock assessment model. All right, so the ESP initiative in the Northeast was inspired by the Alaska process, and it has many similarities. However, there have also been several key ways in which the Northeast ESP development and process has differed due to regional characteristics. And those differences have helped us better understand the strengths and limitations of the ESP process. So I'm going to give a brief overview of how ESPs have developed in the Northeast. So in the Northeast, we have been producing a State of the Ecosystem report for almost 10 years, which builds on previous ecosystem status report methods and data. But now we create this shorter report that is tailored to fisheries management needs. So that State of the Ecosystem report aggregates several ecosystem indicators that are relevant to fisheries management performance and objectives. And they provide a detailed look at system trends and potential risks to meeting management objectives. However, the State of the Ecosystem report does not typically connect those ecosystem indicators to potential impacts on the single stock level. So we are adapting the ESP process to help incorporate this ecosystem level information into the single stock management process. Since 2001, we've been working to produce our first iteration of ESP reports, and we are in the process also of working to formalize and standardize those ESP reports by holding center-wide workshops, the next one of which is occurring this May. And we also benefit a lot from being able to look on the Alaska process as a starting point, and now by working with the new National ESP Initiative. So before showing an overview of what we've done with ESPs in the Northeast, it makes sense to explain how we picked the stocks for which we have done ESPs. So we are making use of our research track stock assessment timeline, which is set by the Northeast Regional Coordinating Council. This is a process that sets a 5-year timeline of the stock assessment schedule, with about 2 to 4 stocks assessed each year with an in-depth research track stock assessment, which used to be called a benchmark stock assessment, and I believe most other regions still call it a benchmark stock assessment. And this prioritization used to set this stock research track stock assessment timeline has been based on several of the same metrics that were considered in Alaska during their metrics assessment. So we are just leveraging this existing Northeast Regional Coordinating Council process rather than trying to do a whole new metrics assessment from the ground up. So the research track stock assessment process also lends itself to ESP creation because it includes a term of reference that requires consideration of ecosystem and climate influences on the stock as part of the assessment. So the ESP can be a tool that the stock assessment working group uses to help address that term of reference. And in terms of timeline, the research track stock assessments typically take about 1.5 years from start to finish. And because these assessments are occurring maybe once every 5 years or so for each stock, the assessments are also updated in a shorter process more frequently than that, which we now are calling management track stock assessments. Just so you don't think we only assess stocks every 5+ years. All right, so with those scheduling considerations in mind, here's a brief overview of the ESPs, but also some kind of similar work that has occurred during the research track stock assessments, and additional projects that are ongoing or upcoming in the Northeast. So, like I mentioned, now that ecosystem considerations are a mandatory component of our research track stock assessment process, some of these reports, as a result, have focused a little bit more on the ecosystem side of the ecosystem and socioeconomic profile. And there have also been other additional research track stock assessments beyond the couple that I'm listing here. These are just the ones that have most closely followed an ESP or ESP-like process, and a lot of the people who have been involved in these groups are now working with us as we continue to develop our ESP process in the Northeast. So there has been a broad group of people involved in the creation of these products, partly due to the kind of mandatory aspect of ecosystem considerations component that we now have in our stock assessment process. So back to describing the details of our ESP process. Similar to Alaska, we have our synthesize step that centers around creating a conceptual model of the stock's life history. We have put a little more focus into the literature review part of this step because oftentimes the people working on our ESPs don't necessarily have an in-depth background on the stock. So we have developed some guidelines for running semi-systematic literature review using Web of Science. And like I mentioned, we've had a lot of different folks involved in these ESPs. So actually, each of our ESPs has had a different first author, and that's resulted in some variability in the analyses pursued for each stock. But in general, the ESPs present indicator time series and some assessment of the trend and status of those indicators and potential correlations with stock dynamics. So while I was preparing this talk and kind of taking stock of everything we've worked on so far, I was a little disappointed to realize that like our analyses have been kind of diverse across our stocks. But then I was looking at the Alaska timeline and I realized that they initiated their ESP process in 2014, published their first ESP in 2017, and then had their standardized ESP format come out in 2020. So I think actually we're right on track. We're in a really good place to build a more standardized and reproducible format in the next year or two. And because we have a lot of collaborators, contributors, and a lot of analyses that have been tested out, we have a lot of opportunities to find what works best for us. So continuing on that theme, we have a little bit of variability in our ESP reports. All of our Northeast ESPs have been included with the research track stock assessment documentation as a working paper. There has been a little bit of variability in the length and structure, again, just resulting from having different groups involved to develop each ESP. And that this is specifically one topic that we're going to be discussing at our upcoming center-wide workshop that I mentioned, so that we can start to standardize this process and develop guidelines for future ESPs that will improve the cohesiveness and make the process easier to replicate and maintain over time. Now, I just wanted to give a specific example of one ESP that we have conducted in the Northeast. So the first ESP was conducted for bluefish in 2021 and 2022. Its goal was mostly to pilot the ESP process and develop best practices rather than an immediate kind of reaction to a specific concerning trend that we were seeing in the stock. Bluefish is actually doing pretty well. So I led this ESP and conducted a literature review of ecosystem impacts on bluefish, which informed a conceptual model of life history that is pictured here on this slide. So based on this conceptual model, along with socioeconomic considerations, the working group and I developed a list of potential indicators that we discussed and narrowed down based on what we termed theoretical and operational merit or suitability. So basically based on the proposed mechanistic importance of the indicator, representing something that's a key bottleneck for the stock, but then also taking into account the ease of acquiring and analyzing that indicator. So this was a really useful way of thinking about the indicators and prioritizing which ones to pursue. And these kind of framework of assessing indicators has helped other ESP working groups in their own indicator development processes. So the analyses that we conducted as part of the ESP generally supported fishery industry reports of bluefish moving offshore and northward. We also assessed temperature data and found that current temperatures are mostly within bluefish's optimal range, although in some areas they're kind of approaching the top of that range. So eventually there could be some temperatures that are unfavorably warm for bluefish. And then finally, our socioeconomic indicators suggested that we might be seeing a shift towards a catch and release fishery because landings have decreased relative to catch. And this ESP did support some of the model choices about defining regions and seasons, time blocks, as well as beginning to track some environmental covariates that could be tested within the stock assessment model. And So even though it was primarily used to support modeling decisions made by the working group, being able to track this ecosystem and socioeconomic information is important because there could be changes in the future, and having this comprehensive contextual information can help us anticipate future impacts rather than only being able to react to changes after they occur. All right, so getting towards the end here, I want to discuss some of the parallels and differences between what has happened for ESPs in Alaska versus the Northeast, and then also talk a little bit about the national ESP initiative that I mentioned. So keeping the conversations open between Alaska and the Northeast has really helped us improve the utility and the process of ESP development by identifying the similarities and differences between the ESPs in both regions. So in this table, I am breaking down several of the logistical components that go into ESP creation and comparing how these two regions have approached those steps so far. So some of these decisions are kind of externally governed by the general existing stock assessment process and fisheries management councils, while other differences are constrained by kind of technology or personnel available at each center. But together, these logistics show how the core components of the ESPs can stay the same while allowing for regional flexibility. So starting with the stock assessment schedule, we have several differences between Alaska and the Northeast. Alaska has an annual calendar. Like I mentioned, most of their stocks are assessed every year or every other year on a very coordinated schedule, very synchronous, where pretty much all of their groundfish are assessed at the same time, and most of the crabs are also assessed at the same time, whereas in contrast, we have this two-track process in the Northeast with the research track and management track. Those also run kind of seasonally, so there's some assessments happening in spring, some in fall, so it's just a bit more asynchronous in the Northeast. And then as a result of those differing stock assessment schedules, the ESP schedules differ across the two regions. So both regions have paired ESPs with stock assessments, although that's not strictly necessary. And that's something we might like to discuss as part of our national initiative if there's potential benefits of decoupling ESPs and stock assessment. So like I mentioned earlier, in Alaska, the annual ESP timeline is pretty fast because they get a request in the late fall, and then they try to produce that ESP by the following summer so that it can be used, incorporated into the stock assessment modeling decisions and development. And then in the Northeast, we are also pairing our ESPs with our research track stock assessments, but though the timeline is just a little bit different there, they usually take about 1.5 years to complete. So there's just generally a little more time to develop the ESP and analyses. So for indicator creation, we have a couple regional differences as well. The Alaska Center is now testing out their request for indicators process, so soliciting contributions from contributors, whereas in the Northeast, we've kind of defaulted to having the ESP team create a lot of the indicators through spatial analysis of global data sets. And that's kind of reflective of some of the spatial methods that we had already developed as part of our State of the Ecosystem report, taking those and adapting them for our ESP needs. But those aren't the only two options. So for example, on the national level, we would love to eventually have a library of standard indicators that could be maintained kind of on a central and national scale, and then those could be accessed by people in different regions as needed to add to their own ESPs. Data hosting is another area where we see some regional differences. So Alaska has an institution called the Alaska Fisheries Information Network, ACFIN, and that collects their indicator contributions into a database and hosts that data through an accessible web service. Whereas in the Northeast, we don't have that kind of center-wide data hosting institution. So we have a lot of our ESP data on GitHub to make it publicly accessible. And that this is an area where we're really hoping that the growing national collaboration can help us develop and improve methods that we can apply across regions so we can streamline our process, have a familiar process across regions, and just make things a little more similar across the board. Figures and tables are an area where collaboration across regions has already been really helpful in improving the process, both in Alaska and the Northeast. So there is some initial code to produce figures developed at the Alaska Center. We then built on that in the Northeast to create our own graphics. We made it more reproducible by developing a prototype R package and R Markdown templates. Then we kind of went back to Alaska and worked collaboratively to develop some similar tools for them. And as a result, the Alaska process has become a lot more streamlined, a lot quicker to reproduce every year, which has been really helpful, especially with this short report card format that needs to be updated very frequently. So moving forward, we'd like to use the National ESP Initiative to develop more automated figures and tables that can be used by regions to further streamline that ESP process and reduce the barrier to entry. So the final step of the ESP is to communicate the results. In both cases, we're doing that by including the ESP within the kind of packet of stock assessment documents, either as a working paper or an appendix. The Alaska Center's gotten a bit further in terms of developing a specific template that they use for their reports, whereas, like I mentioned, in the Northeast, we're still working to put that template together. And that is something that we hope can also benefit from the national collaboration so that we can have some guidance and templates available across regions that will help this whole process go more quickly. So ESPs can improve stock assessment models and improve scientific advice for setting harvest control rules independently of the stock assessment model, like I mentioned, through processes such as risk tables. But they also contribute to broader agency goals, such as NOAA's strategic goals to strengthen the blue economy through developing science for climate-ready fisheries. NOAA Fisheries has an agency-wide ecosystem-based fisheries management policy and roadmap that includes guiding principles of implementing ecosystem-level planning, advancing our understanding of ecosystem processes, exploring and addressing trade-offs, incorporating ecosystem considerations into management advice, among others. ESPs help all of those guiding principles, and they're also becoming a central topic of conversation regarding how we can integrate climate projections with fisheries management. So ecosystem and socioeconomic profiles were identified as an avenue for informing management and stakeholders within the Climate, Ecosystem and Fisheries Initiative, CEFI, which could help include regional ocean modeling efforts as part of ESP indicators and subsequent scientific advice. There's additional NOAA fisheries initiatives around providing frameworks to incorporate ecosystem and contextual information into fishery science and advice to help improve our understanding of ecosystems and ability to plan for change. ESPs contribute really nicely to those initiatives as well. And all regions have their own regional action plans. And ESPs can help those kind of regional specific questions help contribute to the plans for rebuilding and sustainability of commercially and culturally important fisheries. ESPs, have been identified as an on-ramp for a lot of other climate integrated modeling efforts like the ACLIME and NCLIME. So it's not just the Northeast that has been inspired by the ESPs coming out of Alaska. There's interest in ESPs across the nation, and some regions have produced their own ESP reports or similar products. The Pacific Islands started fisher interviews for their Uku ESP in late 2020, and they produced their first Uku ESP report in 2022. Since then, they've developed a report card template and presented that to their advisory panel. The Northwest and Southwest both have some ESP-like reports for some of their stocks, and they're currently evaluating a new ecosystem initiative, which includes creating risk tables for groundfish stocks and using an ESP-like workflow to determine those risk table decisions. And then finally, in the Southeast, they have created an ESP-like report card on gray snapper following the Alaska example, which is also similar to the Uku report card. So this increase in momentum across all centers inspired the creation of a national ESP coordination initiative, which began in 2022. The purpose of this national initiative is to open multiple lines of communication to share ESP progress across science centers and to create efficiencies as ESPs are developed and integrated into fisheries management. So our national coordination team helps bridge the gap between ecosystem, economic, and stock assessment communities by encouraging cooperation and communication across a wide variety of programs towards this common goal of implementing ecosystem-based fisheries management. So with a more unified approach to integrating ecosystem and socioeconomic information into the stock assessment process, we allow for tracking progress towards ecosystem-based fisheries management, and that can also help us prioritize data gaps and research projects that will help improve these initiatives. So as part of this coordination project, we've created a national ESP workshop series, which so far has included 3 types of workshop events. We have co-creating, sharing, and synthesizing themed workshops. We had 2 virtual share workshops in July 2022 and 2023. And then we hosted a co-creating workshop at the Pacific Islands Fisheries Science Center in conjunction with the NOAA Fisheries National Ecosystem Modeling Workshop, NEMAO, in August 2023. We used that workshop to discuss developing ESPs in the Pacific Islands and ran some coding demonstrations to share methods. And we are now currently planning our 3rd virtual share workshop, which will be held later in the spring or possibly early summer. And if you are interested in attending that workshop or being added to our email list, you can fill out the linked survey, which is linked in the slides. And I will also put the link in the chat in just a moment. Our coordination team is working on writing up tech memos for the past workshops and establishing formal terms of reference for our group. We're considering some new proposed coordination activities to further our goals towards national ESP initiative, including a national webpage, a kind of living guidance document, continued workshops and activities across the different regions, and then tracking our ESP metrics and progress to report to NOAA Fisheries leadership. So finally, second to last slide, I just want to cover quickly some of the technical details where the national ESP collaboration has really has a lot of potential to help streamline and improve our process in the different regions. So the first is a data management application created in conjunction with the Alaska Science Center and the Alaska Fisheries Information Network, ACFIN, which I mentioned briefly earlier. So this is a data submission tool that allows collaborators to upload the indicators, the data that is used in the ESPs. It has a metadata module so that you can include description and details for each indicator, comments for kind of a conversation between the contributor and the data administrator, and it tracks data submissions from year to year. And it also has the ability to include any data that's already within the ACFIN database system. So that has been really helpful for managing the logistics of the workflow within Alaska. And we hope to expand this system to other regions by including some of the global data products and creating different regional views that other centers could use to access data that would be relevant for their own stocks. Now, our second kind of data initiative is a reproducibility project that was started as an effort between Alaska and the Northeast Science Centers. Mentioned this briefly earlier as well. We built on some previous coding methods to create an R package, which is available on GitHub and linked on this slide. And that really helps make the data processing, figure creation, table creation process a lot more quick and reproducible. And that also has built on a lot of the OpenScapes community work, which has kind of been a foundation for a lot of these data projects at NOAA Fisheries over the past couple of years. So we would also love to expand this R package to include more graphics and reporting templates and utilities that would be useful across regions. And so hopefully that's something that we can continue to develop and share out as part of our national collaboration. All right, so to close, I just want to leave you with these three major takeaways from today. ESPs provide regions with a structured but adaptable approach to support and track climate-informed fisheries management and ecosystem-based fisheries management. We have a national ESP coordination group that is helping different fisheries science centers across the nation through workshops and communication forums. And finally, we have some data management and automation methods in development that will help launch, streamline, and coordinate the ESP process across all 6 science centers. So I can take a few questions now, or please feel free to reach out to me over email, which is on the slide, and I can also put that in the chat in just a moment as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abby. I really appreciated your presentation, and you can go ahead and put your webcam on. Audience, we have, let's see, about 6 minutes for your questions, and we would love to hear them. So please type them in the Q&A chat. It's on the right side of your screen, and I'll upload them to Abby. But as a reminder to this, if you're new to this platform, you're able to ask questions anonymously if you prefer that your name not be shown on screen. So just click the button at the very bottom of the Q&A tab. And one more quick reminder before we start with our questions. We are recording this presentation, so if there was anyone who missed it and could benefit from watching it live, then, the recording, please go to our YouTube channel, which I've just put into the chat. Okay, let's see. I do see a question. Give me one moment to approve it. And this first question, Abby, asks, how have ESPs been used in management decisions in the process of setting ABCs and ACLs or somewhere else?
Yeah, so let me describe what I know about the Alaska process with the caveat that I work in the Northeast, but they have come the farthest in operationalizing that ESP information into their fisheries management decisions. So they have a risk table, and actually I will put a link to the paper about this in the chat because I had that up. I thought someone might ask about it. So they have a risk table, which basically considers how much uncertainty is there in the assessment itself, in the population dynamics, and then finally in the ecosystem and environment. And so the ESP helps inform the risk level of risk that they determine is present in the environmental conditions. And based on kind of the holistic picture of what the risk table is saying, there are the council may choose to lower the catch advice from the maximum projected by the stock assessment model. So hope that makes sense.
So this next question asks, are we missing important factors by developing ESPs for single stocks rather than by fishery or ecosystem? Especially for socioeconomic indicators, fishery effects are more important than single species effects.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I think, I mean, yes, when we choose to present information in one way, we're always not presenting it in another way. And that does kind of inherently limit some of the applications. But the goal of the ESPs is that a lot of ecosystem and socioeconomic information is already presented kind of holistically on a coast level, on a fishery level, on like a regional level. And so because fisheries management, a lot of that does take place on the single stock level, we wanted to be able to also include ecosystem and socioeconomic information into that single stock process. So I think you need both, definitely. You can't get everything you need from just one. But I do think that our ESP process is hopefully improving the existing systems. And another thing we've talked about is kind of, the big to small to big, going from coastwide to single stock ESP and maybe back to coastwide by looking at ESPs across a region or across a suite of fisheries, and kind of using that as a way to keep focused on potential larger trends. So I hope that helps.
It looks like we're just about at the hour, so I think that's going to be our last question. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today, in particular to Abby and to Bai for organizing this series. Audience, I hope you'll join us again next month, the first Thursday of the month at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for the next National Stock Assessment Science Seminar. So take care and enjoy the rest of your day.